Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Joseph Goldstein. Joseph is a meditation teacher, an author, and was one of the key figures in introducing mindfulness meditation to the West. He is the co-founder of the Insight Meditation Society, or IMS, with Jack Kornfield and Sharon Salzberg, where he's currently a resident teacher. He's written many popular books on Buddhist meditation, including The Experience of Insight, One Dharma, and Mindfulness, a practical guide to awakening. He's the lead teacher on the 10% Happier meditation app, and you can hear some of his Dharma talks on his podcast, Joseph Goldstein's Insight Hour. Our conversation focuses on some of the core ideas in Buddhist meditation, including non-clinging, impermanence, emptiness, and the illusion of the self. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Joseph Goldstein. Joseph, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Oh, you're very welcome.
So maybe we can begin at an obvious starting point with how you first came to discover Buddhism and meditation for yourself.
Well, I was studying philosophy at university. And then when I finished that, I joined the American Peace Corps. And I ended up in Thailand. And so I was just teaching English in Bangkok. And I started going to a discussion group that a couple of monks, Buddhist monks, were leading for Westerners. And that really kind of prompted my interest. Of course, I having had studied philosophy, I went to these groups and asked so many questions, of these poor monks, that people stopped coming because I was going. I was so annoying to the group. So finally, one of the monks said, Joseph, why don't you try meditating? I think it was just to get me to be quiet a little bit. So he gave me just the very beginning instruction. I was very young, I was just like 21 years old, first time in Asia, didn't know really anything about Buddhism, or meditation. So he gave me some just basic instructions. I got my, paraphernalia together, sit down, set my alarm clock for 5 minutes, so I didn't sit too long. But something actually quite extraordinary happened. Not any big enlightenment experience, but even in that first 5 minutes, I saw that there was a way to turn the attention to look into the mind as well as looking out through it. And that was revelatory to me. The fact that there actually was a methodology for looking into the mind. And that was it. I was hooked. When I finished the Peace Corps, then I came back to the States and realized I needed a teacher, and then went back to India and then found a teacher and then really devoted myself to the practice.
And when you found a teacher, that was in the Vipassana tradition, am I right, that you've dedicated your teaching career to?
Yeah. So when I went back to India, looking for a teacher. I went, traveled around a bit, ended up in Bodh Gaya, where I met my first teacher, Munindraji, and he was teaching Vipassana. I didn't know I was looking for Vipassana. I was just looking for some kind of meditative guidance. And I went to a few different ashrams and, trying to just meet different teachers. When I went to Bodh Gaya and met Munindraji, my first teacher, he had just come back from Burma, spending 9 years there. And he was starting to teach Vipassana, and that was it. He said something so simple when I first met him. It really hooked me. He said, if you want to understand your mind, sit down and observe it. I mean, there was nothing to join. There was no ritual. There was no set. It was just that. And it made so much common sense to me. How else can we understand our minds except by observing it? So that was it. I was hooked.
And am I right that before you came across Vipassana, you had a kind of major moment of insight hearing a reading from a Tibetan book, the Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation?
I did. Yeah. So while I was still in the Peace Corps, a friend and I, he was actually a British guy who was working for the British Council, teaching at the school that I was teaching. And we had become friends, and I was just hanging out in the garden of his house, and we were both interested in exploring lots of different things. And he started reading from this Tibetan text. It was an old version, which the name of it was in that version was the Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation. As I since have come to learn, it's not a very good translation. However, it had this profound effect on me. He was reading it. I was really, for whatever reason, my mind was very, very still and quiet. And just as he was reading the text, which is really a text of instruction for looking directly at the nature of the mind, and then just something opened up that was quite incredible, of a real understanding of selflessness, which of course is a core Buddhist teaching, but it really came to life for me, in that moment.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That I think I have the same translation of that book, and it's the first spiritual text that really resonated with me. And Alan Wallace, I also spoke to, the Dzogchen teacher, he as well was first. That was his first, I think, big aha moment with a religious text, and we've all been reading the wrong translation, I think.
Yeah.
But
there were a few key words that were I think sometimes translated okay.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder, I think the audience won't forgive me if I don't try to get you to describe something of what the experience was like, although I'm sure it's very hard to describe. But yeah, could you say something about what happened in your mind at the moment when you heard this text?
Yeah. So a lot of the text was about just looking into the nature of mind. So a lot of the refrain was look within, and look with. So I was just following that instruction, as I was listening, and then it went on to describe, from that Tibetan viewpoint, the nature of the mind as being unformed, uncreated, unborn, and somehow when my friend was just was repeating that, and with the word unborn, it's like something stopped in my mind or opened in my mind. And the way I described it to myself, just after that moment, which was very radical. I mean, it was like a lightning bolt. The image that came to mind was just the experience of zero. Just zero. But that had the function of, and again, all this was new to me. It was completely unexpected. It's not that I had been following a path at that point. It was just kind of a spontaneous happening. From that experience of the mind opening to whatever one likes to call it, the unborn or the uncreated or zero, the function of that experience was to see through the illusion of self, and so I remember, again, this is in a very naive way, because I didn't really have any context for any of this. It was kind of out of the blue. So I remember kind of saying to myself, there's no me. There's no me. So it was like, it was that all of a sudden, like, everything changed. And I don't know if that's
that's great.
Describes much, but
yeah, no, I think also the concept unborn. I think there's this Zen koan of what is the face you had before you were born. That really resonates with me as well.
Right.
It seems to precipitate a similar insight that's kind of wordless. But it's interesting that you found Vipassana to be the tradition that you end up devoting yourself to. And was it the pragmatism? You mentioned that it's just the instruction of just look at your mind. Was that the thing that really resonated?
Well, just a little backstory to that. When I went back to India to look for a teacher, and I realized, after that experience in Thailand, I went back to the States. I had finished my time in the Peace Corps, and I tried to practice by myself, but I really hadn't had any, very extensive instruction. So I was just mixing up a lot of things I was doing, mantras and third eye and whatever I had heard about meditation. I got very confused, and so that's when I realized I needed a teacher. So I went back to Asia, to India, and I actually went looking for some Tibetan teachers, since that had happened through a Tibetan text. But for whatever reason, karmic or otherwise, I went up to the mountains where I thought the Tibetans were staying, but they had all gone south. You know, and so I was traveling around to different ashrams, and I ended up in Bodh Gaya. And it was when I met Munindra and he described the practice. It was the simplicity and the pragmatism and the lack of I don't know what the right word is. The lack of a lot of extra stuff. It was just this direct look at, just look at your mind. So it seemed to reflect very much my experience and what I was looking for. Okay, so there was this kind of transformative moment, but then what do I do with that? And how do I understand it further? And so it just made a lot of sense to me. The clarity of it and the simplicity of it, and the directness of it.
Yeah, it's very interesting what it is that leads to these different traditions resonating with different people. I think because as you were describing the lack of extra stuff, it reminded me of a talk I heard from Ram Dass, who I think you spent some time studying with, or not studying under him, but knowing him. And
we were friends in Bodh Gaya. Yeah.
Right. And he was saying, he was coming from this kind of psychological training, and Buddhism intellectually really appealed. But then for whatever reason, the kind of Hindu tradition just kind of grabbed him and took him over. And he said he thought he didn't like all the gods and all the extra paraphernalia. But it's just interesting. I guess we're kind of lucky to have so many different traditions, in a perennial way. They can all lead to the same place, but whatever, you can have whatever resonates with you.
Ram Dass, he had that strong bhakti devotional side that needed expression, which he found with his guru. Yeah.
Right. And so with Vipassana, so this is the Theravada tradition, right? As opposed to, I guess you could call, depending on different ways of cataloging, the Tibetan would be Vajrayana or Mahayana. And this is coming out of Burma or Myanmar, as it's now called, right? And is it right to say that it's grounded in the Satipatthana Sutta, and that mindfulness is a very central part of this?
Yeah, very much. It is the practice of Satipatthana. And so that's the discourse the Buddha gave on the four foundations of mindfulness. And even though it's a relatively short discourse, maybe 8 or 9 pages long. It's not that long, but it contains within it a wide variety of ways of practicing it. And Munindra had told me that in Burma itself, there are over 50 different techniques of Vipassana. So it's not just one method within that understanding. There are many approaches to it. Yeah.
Right, and I think you also, you've trained with lots of great masters, including Goenka, who I know the method. Am I right that the kind of method that you teach comes from a slightly different lineage of Vipassana, because there's Goenka very much emphasized body scan, right?
Yeah. So the lineage that I'm now teaching out of, so to speak, is from Burma and Mahasi Sayadaw, who was one of the great, meditation masters in Burma. But my own predilection in spiritual practice, and you may be familiar, some years ago I wrote this book, One Dharma, because my mind likes to see what unifies different traditions rather than create these strong boundaries between them. And so even though the main thrust of the teaching comes out of this tradition of Mahasi Sayadaw, really interweave a lot of different approaches. And as you mentioned, I did study with Goenkaji for about 4 years. And he does emphasize the body scanning. In the Mahasi system, it's more beginning with the breath and then a more choiceless awareness. But they're not in conflict in any way. And so even now, sometimes I'll just be sitting and, spend some time scanning the body and then open up. So even though some people think that there's huge differences, there are, some difference in methodology, but they're not critical differences. They're just different ways of developing mindfulness.
Great. And so you mentioned your book One Dharma, which is a wonderful book I recommend. And yeah, it kind of starts with a crisis, right? I guess that you saw these different kind of
Yeah,
metaphysical
yeah.
systems. But do you think it's kind of a strength of Western Buddhism, that it has the opportunity to integrate lots of different traditions? Do you see that as a positive?
I do, with a caution. Um, so first, it's kind of a new thing that a lot of these Buddhist traditions from Asia are actually meeting and interacting with one another, because in Asia they certainly haven't. You know, having practiced in Asia, the Burmese don't know anything about Tibetan Buddhism, and vice versa, or Zen, or but in the West, these traditions are meeting, often for the first time in centuries. And there's a cross-fertilization which is taking place. And these teachings now, especially with, the internet, they're so widely available. So there's so much accessible, for people. So generally what I suggest to people, in the beginning is to shop around a little bit, just to taste a few different ways and practices and lineages and traditions, to see what really resonates, what inspires us to actually do the practice rather than just read about it. And then to devote some time to that practice, in the beginning, not to be jumping around from one practice to another, because then we really won't get any depth, of understanding. But after some time, after having devoted ourselves for some time and we feel confident in our understanding, of the practice, of the lineage, of the teachings, of our own minds, really, then I think it can be very helpful, just if one is interested, and not necessary, but if one were interested, to explore other practices. So just as an example, after many years of my immersing myself in the Vipassana practice, some friends of mine who had been very involved in Tibetan Buddhism, in Dzogchen practice, they took myself and some friends to meet some of their great teachers in Nepal. And so I began to study a little bit in the Dzogchen lineages. And I just found it very complementary. It really learned a lot from that. And I didn't have any problem kind of synthesizing the two. So I think it is possible to really learn from different perspectives and different traditions at that point where we feel well grounded in one. And so I think that could be an approach.
Yeah. And what was the thing that you found unified all of these different traditions? Was it non-clinging?
Yeah. So you mentioned just a bit earlier kind of the big struggle I went through as I first began the Dzogchen teachings, because the metaphysics are really quite different, from the Burmese and the Dzogchen Tibetan side. And so for a long time, I was just struggling with the question, who's right? Are the Burmese right? Are the Tibetans right? And I was driving myself crazy until I realized I was asking the wrong question. It's not a question of who's right, but really seeing all teachings as skillful means rather than as statements of ultimate truth. So I came up with this phrase, metaphysics as skillful means, and so then skillful means for what? Skillful means ultimately for non-clinging, but we could say skillful means for reducing suffering, for weakening greed and hatred and ignorance, for engendering kindness and compassion. So if a particular practice does that, it doesn't matter what the metaphysics are, so we can learn from it all, even contradictory teachings, if it's all leading to non-clinging. And the Buddha was quite clear that this is the essence of the liberated mind. Very often in the text, he would say liberation through non-clinging. So if a particular practice is leading to that, regardless of the philosophy, or the metaphysical underpinnings, then it's helpful. It's leading us, towards that kind of awakening.
I think this fits really nicely as well with the teachings themselves, because if you understand metaphysics to be it's a story you're telling about the world, and with these practices you see how limited concepts are, and that the world can't be encapsulated by concepts, right? So I think it doesn't have to be a crisis, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. But I had to learn that. It took me a month of tormenting myself. Yeah.
So then, would you define enlightenment in terms of liberation through non-clinging?
I think there are many ways of describing enlightenment, and this is where a lot of the traditions start fighting with one another because they have different descriptions of it. So the couple of the descriptions that I find most helpful, one is that, because it really points to the essence of the liberated mind, the mind that is not clinging to anything. So in one of the Pali texts, it says, "Nothing whatsoever is to be clung to as I or mine. Whoever understands this has understood all the teachings. Whoever practices this has practiced all the teachings. Whoever realizes this has realized all the teachings." So that really, in one way, gets to the essence of it. Nothing whatsoever is to be clung to as I or mine. So that could be one description of the awakened mind. Another one that I really appreciate a lot, also found in the text where the Buddha is describing Nibbana, which is the Pali or Nirvana, in Sanskrit, as the uprooting, or the mind that has uprooted greed, hatred, and ignorance. And I like that too, because it feels to me very pragmatic. And we can really check ourselves. Okay, has greed been uprooted, or are we on the way to uprooting it? Is it being weakened? The same with anger or hatred or delusion. So rather than describing the state in more mystical terms, which one could also do, there are descriptions like that, but I like the pragmatism of, okay, what's the actual effect in the mind? And so those are a couple of descriptions that I appreciate a lot.
Right. And when it comes to the actual, the need to practice meditation in order to change one's habits of clinging, I really appreciated, I was listening to a Dharma talk of yours today on the podcast, and you were talking about, I think you called it catalog consciousness, this mode of flicking through the pages and wanting to want something, which is a very kind of subtle level of clinging, right?
Absolutely. Subtle but pervasive.
Right. And I guess meditation is necessary to catch those kind of nuanced levels of clinging.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And also it's to realize that the Dharma is vast, and so just to give an indication of that, within the Theravada tradition, they talk of 4 stages of awakening. And they call the first one stream entry, or entering the stream towards full enlightenment. And at that point, the view of self has been uprooted. That's what's characteristic of that first stage of awakening. But interestingly enough, there are a lot of unwholesome patterns still remaining in the mind. There's still greed, there's still desire, there's still aversion, there's still restlessness, there's still conceit, the sense of I am. So even though, and this is transformative, we realize all those patterns are selfless, so we've cut through the belief that they belong to anyone. The patterns are still operative because they're very deeply conditioned. And so that's why it's not enough to have a moment's realization. It takes a lot of work. So there's a 11th century Korean Zen master. His name was Shinul. And he has teachings that I also really appreciate a lot. he frames all of his teachings in the phrase sudden awakening, gradual cultivation, acknowledging that can be sudden moments of realization, that really change everything, but then that requires gradual cultivation to further, to bring it to completion, and so I like that model.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that model as well. I think I've a book on him called Tracing Back the Radiance. I think it's called.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
And I feel like I had a similar kind of, I guess, spontaneous awakening experience as a teenager to the one you described. And so I feel like for both of us, there's this, like I heard you say as well in one of your talks that you've been trying to you've basically been trying to integrate that one experience for the rest of your life, or like play catch up to the insight that came along that day.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And still
but so if
working
we, if we, I guess, return to the actual kind of origins of this with the Buddha's teachings, is the Four Noble Truths, is that a kind of a good place to start in terms of thinking about how this is kind of systematically laid out?
Yeah, the Four Noble Truths actually within it contain it all, and it's interesting just in my teaching career and writing. When I first began teaching and in my first book, I had like 5-6 page chapter on the Four Noble Truths. In my latest book, Mindfulness, that's become like, 10 chapters, which I'm saying just to indicate that we can read it and get a kind of basic generalized understanding of it, but there's tremendous depth contained within the teachings of the Four Noble Truths that can really dive into and explore. And it's tremendously rich.
Right. And as you mentioned earlier, that in the Theravada tradition, most of the texts are written in Pali, this language that was spoken at the time of the Buddha. And the Four Noble Truths, right, are centered around dukkha, this word that's often translated as suffering. But I've heard you talk at length on the nuances of what that truly means. And I think there was unsatisfactoriness, I think I've heard you say, but also you spoke about the etymology of it as well, which I would love to hear more about.
So just maybe just a little preface to that of why the usual translation of dukkha as suffering doesn't seem to cover the whole meaning of it, because the Buddha taught that all conditioned things, which is everything we experience, all conditioned things are dukkha. So if we translate it as suffering, that's saying all conditioned things are suffering. But that doesn't really resonate, with the reality of our lives. There are a lot of things that are pleasant and enjoyable, and we don't feel the suffering at all. But if we understand dukkha as ultimately unsatisfying or unreliable, because they're changing, nothing is lasting. So then, in addition to dukkha meaning the obvious kinds of suffering, like when things are painful, but it also includes everything. All conditioned things are dukkha in the sense they're incapable of providing lasting happiness, or lasting ease or peace, because of the truth of impermanence. So it's just important to have this broader view of understanding dukkha. But now I forgot what the original question was.
Well, I was queuing you up to talk about the etymology of it.
All right, yes. So this is part of the dukkha of aging, memory decline. So this is something, I'm not a Pali scholar, and so this is just something I read, but it really resonated. Someone described the etymology. So dukkha, D-U, and then K-H-A. And one of the meanings or the etymology of du means hard or difficult, and ka they were describing as the axle hole for a, the axle in a cart fits into the hole in the wheel, and so dukkha was suggested means when that doesn't fit properly, it's quite a bumpy ride. And I actually had an experience of that one time when I was in Burma. Some friends and I had gone up to Upper Burma to visit Mahasi Sayadaw in his home monastery. So it was way, way out there. So we flew to Mandalay, and then we had to take this, I don't know, couple of hour ride in an ox cart. It was a pretty bumpy ride. And so I could really understand the axle not quite fitting perfectly, into the wheel. So it felt like a good image for what dukkha means. A bumpy ride.
Yeah, I think that's, to a lot of people, I think, the First Noble Truth being translated as life is suffering can be a bit off-putting. But if it's life is a bumpy ride, that sounds a lot more friendly and a lot more...
Exactly. And sometimes there are big bumps, and sometimes, just little ones, but bumpy.
And then the other truths relate to the is it the origin of if we use the word suffering, and then the cessation of suffering, and then the path to the cessation of suffering? Is that a reasonable summary?
Yeah. So there are two different, very closely related mind states, and that is of craving and clinging. So within the Four Noble Truths, they really bring it back. It's almost as if craving is the precursor to clinging. It's because of desire for something, and then if we get it, we cling to it. And if we cling to that which in its very nature is changing, of course we suffer. If we cling to youth, we're going to suffer when we get old. If we cling to summer, we're going to suffer when it's cold. Somebody once described the truth of the dukkha of clinging as being rope burn. If you're trying to hold on to a rope that somebody is pulling through your hand. So if we're trying to hold on to that which is changing, which is everything, of course that clinging is going to result in different kinds of suffering. Craving, which is how it's described in the Four Noble Truths, it brings it back a step before the clinging. And I found this really an interesting place to explore in meditation practice. Well, the Buddha talked about three kinds of craving. One is craving for sense pleasures, which, we're all familiar with that. Then he talked about craving for becoming, of wanting to become this or that. So it's that quality of leaning forward into our experience. And then the final one is craving for non-becoming. But it's the second one that I found really interesting in meditation, because even with very experienced practitioners, once the practice is really rolling along and has become more effortless and we're at ease in it, there's a very strong tendency to be leaning into the next moment. So this is just craving on a moment to moment. We're with the in-breath in order to get to the out-breath. Or we're feeling a sensation in order for it to ease a little bit. Or just some element of that leaning into. And I really began to see that leaning into on a moment-to-moment level is exactly this craving for becoming. So I had I'll just share with you quite a striking understanding come in my meditation and retreat I was doing. So I was sitting and things were just moving along quite, easily. And then there was this one line from the text that came to mind, which I had read a million times before. It was very familiar to me. Whatever has the nature to arise will also pass away. And in the text, very often, if people hear that, they get enlightened, so if one could hear it in the right way. So I had heard that, I'd read it a lot, but at this particular time, because I was sitting and my practice seemed to be going well, that phrase kind of dropped right into the meditative process. Somehow it became more alive for me, not just an intellectual concept. So I'm in this changing process, and then that thought or reflection, whatever has the nature to arise, will also pass away. And I realized, therefore, there's nothing to want. I'm talking about on this meditative level, because whatever it is I might want, even for the next moment, is going to also pass away. So when I saw that, very vividly experientially, whatever has the nature to arise will also pass away, therefore there's nothing to want, I could feel my mind in that moment drop back from that leaning into, and it was just so vivid. And the dropping back really highlighted the second and third noble truth, which is, craving is the cause of the dukkha, and the end of dukkha is the end of craving. And so when I felt the mind drop back, even from that subtle leaning into the next moment, it was that really vivid experience. Oh, the mind really of non-craving. And even though, it didn't last for that long, but it was very clear, and so I really appreciated that we don't have to wait until we're fully enlightened to experience the third noble truth. We can experience it even for moments, when we drop back from craving.
Yeah. You mentioned that was mediated through a recognition of impermanence. And I think, especially in the Theravada tradition, impermanence seems to be really something that's a real key to a lot of these insights. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, definitely. In fact, I was just reading one part of the, from the teaching, from the text, where the Buddha said, this is a paraphrase, I don't remember exactly, but it was through seeing of impermanence, one comes to realize non-self, because nothing is lasting long enough to be self. So impermanence becomes the doorway to seeing non-self. And then he went on to say, in seeing non-self, one eliminates the conceit, I am, and when one eliminates the conceit, I am, one realizes or attains nibbana, the highest peace. So impermanence is a doorway, and an understandable doorway, to realizing non-self and then liberation. Because for many people, the idea of non-self is very confusing. It's counterintuitive to our common sense understanding of ourselves. What do you mean there's no self? I'm here. And so we can, talk about it and describe it and hopefully, help people to come to an understanding of it. But impermanence is that's easily understandable, even if we don't always act on that wisdom, but it's not difficult to understand. And so I think it becomes a very accessible doorway to liberating wisdom.
And I think the concept of emptiness seems to be, at least from what I've seen, seems to be less emphasized in the Theravada tradition than in Mahayana. Is that fair to say?
I think not exactly, because emptiness, in my understanding, the way that term is used, and in Pali and Sanskrit is shunyata, it's emptiness, and that's found. There are some suttas in the Pali Canon on shunyata, on emptiness. Generally, within the Theravada school, emptiness is really synonymous with non-self.
Right.
So it is very much emphasized. I mean, that's key to the whole teaching. In my understanding of Mahayana and Vajrayana teachings, emptiness means that, but also it has a more extended meaning that nothing has any intrinsic self-existence. Not only this mind body is empty of self, but everything, all phenomena have no intrinsic self-existence, meaning that everything that arises out of conditions, and so everything is contingent. So there was one Sri Lankan monk who's quite a famous meditator, scholar. He had a phrase which just resonated with me. He said, everything is circumstantial, not substantial. And so it's just, so even this understanding of emptiness is found within the Theravada, that everything is contingent upon causes.
Right. Yeah. And I guess this relates to the doctrine of two truths. It's a similar idea to there being the kind of the relative and then the absolute or the ultimate.
Yeah. In Mahayana, that description of the two truths is very explicit. As far as I know, those terms are not so widely used, in the Pali Canon, but the meaning is embedded in the teachings, because, and in some way they talk about conventional reality and more ultimate reality. So I guess, it's a very similar teaching, even though that you don't find the phrase, the two truths, very much in Theravada, but the essence is there, definitely.
So I guess people who maybe might struggle with the idea that the self isn't what we think it is, I think it can be sometimes useful to think in these ways when communicating it, because, if you say, the concept James exists relative to you and that it's useful, if someone wants to say James or Joseph, those terms are useful to point to this person or that person relative to each other, right? So there is something that exists in that relative way, but it's convention. It's not, there is no substance or thing that exists that is James, right, in an absolute sense.
Yeah, exactly. There's an image that has come to mind recently, which I think may, help people to understand this, what non-self really means, because it's often confused. People hear that phrase and they may think, oh, when you realize non-self, suddenly you disappear in a cloud of smoke or something. So it's obviously not like that. So the image that I've been using recently, if you're outside, and you're hiking, and maybe you come to the side of a riverbank, and you're just sitting, looking at the river. So then you might, if one was so inclined, well, what is a river? What is a river? So a river is a concept. It's a designation for this flow of water, shaped by topography. So, every river will look different. The speed of the water will be different. The contours will be different. But it's not as if that flow of water belongs to something called a river. River is simply the designation for the flow of water. So self is like river. Self and river is a useful concept. So we can talk about, the Mississippi River or the Amazon River, so we know what we're talking about. But that doesn't make river as being some substantial entity other than a designation for a particular flow of water. And so we use self or Joseph, in just that way. That those terms are a designation for the flow of the mind-body process. So I think, I don't know if that made sense to you, but I think it might help people understand really what selflessness means, because it's very often misunderstood.
Right, and in the way you said that in the Theravada tradition, emptiness and selflessness are sometimes kind of, I guess, maybe used in a close way, like what you just described. Exactly, yeah. What you described, I would say, the river doesn't have essence of river, but because the self is effectively believing that there's essence of James, I see, why that emptiness would just be nothing has any intrinsic essence of anything, including the self, right?
To say that the particular flow, whether it's of water, or of this just mind-body process, doesn't belong to anyone to whom it's happening, that what we call self is the flow, but it's also to acknowledge that each mind-body flow is unique, because each of the elements, are conditioned in different ways. And that's why the concept river or the concept James or Joseph is helpful, because, we can designate different flows, which is why you and I and everybody are individuals in that sense. But it's only a description of the pattern of the flow.
Right. And so you mentioned that there's this, with the self, there's this feeling of the experience belonging to someone, right? This thing of,
right.
These are James's, like James is seeing, or these are James's experiences. And I guess the insight, a part of the insight is realizing that that's entirely additional, right? There's just the experience.
Exactly. But as you said, it has a usefulness, right, to be able to call it James or Joseph, but it doesn't really refer to anything other than the particular patterns of the flow of the mind-body elements, and your patterns are different than my patterns, And, is this podcast going to be just audio or also visual?
Both. There'll be both versions.
Okay, so I wanted to give a little visual illustration. Usually we think of all experience referring back to a self, to me. Okay, I'm the one who's having the experience. And that's our usual way of operating in the world. The understanding of selflessness is not that it refers back to anyone, but rather that all experience is like this. So the experience is exactly the same. It's not denying the truth of what's arising, but instead of it referring back to anyone, it is just what it is. And so each moment is this, it's this, it's this, it's this, it's this. And so that's what it means, that there's no one to whom it refers, but that does not negate the experience. The experience remains the same.
This may be a kind of tricky thing to try to articulate, but I wonder, how do you think of the relationship to clinging and the illusion of the self? Because they seem to be deeply related, but in a kind of complex way, I guess.
Well, so one, I'd say there are two levels of this that come to mind. So one level is where we're clinging to the idea or the concept of self. We're clinging to the view that there is a self. And this is pretty common. I mean, this is how most people are moving through the world, with a strong attachment to the view. Yes, that there's a unchanging Joseph in here, to whom experience is happening. So that's one level of clinging. But on another more, I would say, momentary level, rather than use the word clinging, I find it more helpful to describe it in terms of being identified with phenomena. And so a thought arises, and the habit is to be identified with the thought, or a sensation identified with a sensation or an emotion. I'm angry, I'm sad, I'm excited, I'm thinking, I'm walking, and so we identify with whatever the experience is. But that identification is extra, and one of the powers of mindfulness meditation is that we practice being with experience without that added aspect of being identified with it. So I just find that notion of identification with something, it really is another way of expressing clinging, but it seems to me to highlight the actual process in the mind of how this sense of the felt sense of self is created.
Right. And when it comes to identification, you were talking about the flow of experience. We usually identify with certain parts of it, and we say it belongs to us. And then you can move into maybe identifying with the experiences, with the flow of experience itself. But I've heard
Yeah,
you talk
yeah.
very eloquently about how I think a lot of people can end up identifying with consciousness and feeling like that's the end point. But you talk about it still being a kind of subtle identification happening there.
Yes. that that seems to be the last holdout of self, because even as we begin to see kind of the impermanence of everything else, and so with some degree of introspection, and reflection, we can see that the body is changing and thoughts come and go and emotions come and go. And so maybe through the seeing of impermanence, we begin to get at least perhaps a glimpse of what selflessness means. But generally, people will then still be identified with, well, I'm the one who's knowing all this, the knower of the impermanence. And so practicing in different ways to cut through the identification with knowing feels to me like the final breakthrough. And there are different ways of doing that.
Yeah, I feel like several years ago, after listening to you talk about this, I felt like I gained a kind of deeper intellectual understanding through meditative experience of reflecting on what you'd said, and yeah, it felt kind of like shifting from maybe saying I am to just is. You just completely obliterate the I, and just everything just is.
Exactly.
Just get rid of the identification.
Yeah,
and that kind of,
yeah.
I think for a lot of people, in kind of spiritual circles today, there seems to be, not to drag you into metaphysics, but a lot of people, I think, have these kinds of experiences and then think that it makes sense to have a metaphysics in which only consciousness exists. Consciousness is the ultimate, and it's what we are. This kind of brings me full circle to where we began, which I think the sheer pragmatism of Buddhism, and it's kind of through moving beyond concepts, through getting rid of attachment, I feel like it can give you an intuitive sense of what reality is that's beyond any models, beyond any concepts, beyond any narrative, beyond any metaphysics. You just kind of feel like reality is beyond words, and that's kind of where I sit. But there are a lot of people I think who I think have this identification with consciousness and feel it to it kind of informs their metaphysics as well. But yeah, do you feel like Buddhism has informed your way of thinking about reality?
Well, it's an interesting question, which I've been very involved. I've been very involved with, because even within Theravada Buddhism, not to speak of the other traditions of Buddhism, there are different metaphysics, and some schools of Buddhism really posit that the nature of, we could say, freedom or ultimate understanding is awareness. And other schools say freedom transcends awareness. So this was my dilemma back when I was trying to figure out the different traditions. So what I've come to, rather than try to again decide who's right, I think the key question in either understanding. So we'll just take the understanding that awareness is the fundamental reality, which is part of some schools of Buddhism. So the key point for me would be, even within that way of describing it, the key point is that awareness being identified with or not? So the freedom is in non-identification. And then I'm waiting to become fully enlightened to decide the issue. Is ultimate reality awareness, or does it transcend awareness? Just wait and see. But in the meantime, the essence of freedom does not depend on that. It depends on not being identified with any of it. And that's what, in my understanding, that's really where the freedom lies. So then again, we could take that very question, those different metaphysical views about the nature of ultimate reality. We could take those two as skillful means. So as people present the teachings of awareness as being ultimate reality, are they presented in such a way that frees the mind from craving and clinging, or not? And the other teachings, does it work to free the mind or not, rather than get caught on who's right?
Right. I really like that, because I think my feeling about the stories we tell about the nature of reality, because we can never really know for certain, and we're always kind of reaching beyond our limits to some extent. I think they often serve a kind of emotional function. We feel out what feels right to us, and this is as true
Yes, yes.
for fundamentalist, religious people who have certain
Yes.
metaphysics, through to scientists. So certain scientists who become nihilists, and I think because of their own emotional issues, projected onto reality and say reality is terrible and hostile, and that's another
Yeah, yeah,
that's another kind of,
yeah, yeah,
in some way, comforting story. And I think that
yeah,
I feel like when it comes to metaphysics, if you don't have the kind of the practice of non-attachment, or the practice of figuring out where it is that you're subtly trying to fulfill certain emotional needs through attachment or aversion, I think there's a really powerful. They should really go hand in hand, I guess, metaphysics and meditation,
yeah,
in
yeah,
my opinion. Um,
yeah, yeah. Well, that's why I like the pragmatism of just that
right.
very brief phrase, liberation through non-clinging. So that we can just, we can just look at our minds to the extent that we can. Okay, is there clinging here in one way or another or not? And that can be very subtle, of course. So, and that's why ongoing practice is needed. And that's why Chanel's frame is so good, sudden awakening, gradual cultivation, because there are so many subtle aspects of delusions still in the mind.
Right. And so maybe a place to end. There are two concepts in Buddhism of rebirth or reincarnation. I think rebirth might be the more accurate term, and
Yes,
also karma,
yes,
which I feel like the way they're presented in the West are very kind of simplified, or the idea that there's some kind of soul that gets kind of passed on through life after life. And I guess and the karma is some kind of magical weighing of the scales and retribution. But I've heard you kind of talk in a way that feels more naturalistic, almost. If you have an understanding of reality as a kind of flow or a process, that I mean, I guess what I'm reaching for is it always bothered. I always wondered what is reincarnated in a Buddhist view if there is no self. So maybe you
yeah,
could speak to that.
yeah. So it really is, in my understanding, just the continuity of this process of change, and but there is the belief that it goes on after the physical death. So that's what many people in the West don't particularly believe. But within the Buddhist context, so it's not as if there's some being that is reincarnated, that goes from life to life. Rather, it's simply the same continuity or continuation of the process. So going back to the image of the river, you might think, oh, sometimes the river is up in the mountains and then goes through the plains and then it goes through, a swamp. And so it goes through different terrains, and we might think of each terrain as a new life. It's taking on a new form dependent on conditions, but it's simply a continuation of the same flow. And so we could just think of, and this is how it's described in the Buddhist psychology, this mind-body process unfolding, each moment conditioning in one way or another the next moment. And so it's talked about how the death consciousness, the consciousness at the moment of death, as it's described, conditions the arising of rebirth consciousness, and then a new life continues. So it's not that anything is carried from one to the other, but each moment is imprinting the next, imprinting the next, imprinting the next. So that, and there is a kind of, according to the teachings, a cause and effect relationship in that conditioning. So it's not happening chaotically or randomly. Different actions create different results. And so it's really just a a continuation of this cause and effect process over time.
And karma is can that be understood in the same way, that everything's just conditioning everything else, and what goes around comes around in the end?
Yeah. So one thing I think is important to understand. I think people often misunderstand, as they're beginning to learn about karma. It can sometimes sound like, well, everything is karmically determined, and so, oh, that's just your karma. But according to the teachings, karma is just one of the laws governing the process. And there are other laws. There are just laws of biological nature, or chemical laws of physics. There are lots of different causes which shape this unfolding process. But karma is included as being one of those laws. So we shouldn't take it to be the ultimate determinant of everything we experience, because that's not true. But it's a powerful determinant, of some aspects of our experience. And, the Buddha highlighted the nature of this law of karma in his emphasis on the importance of motivation, before actions. And, very simply, he said, if we're motivated by greed or anger or ignorance, it's going to bring about some unwholesome result or unskillful result. Whereas, actions motivated by generosity or love or wisdom bring about happiness. I find that extremely helpful and motivating, just to remind you that our actions actually have consequences. They're not just isolated events in moments in time. Everything's a seed that's being planted. And so what kind of plants and flowers do we want to enjoy? Yeah.
Hopefully we've planted some positive seeds in this conversation.
Yeah, well, I hope so. I hope so.
Thank you so much for your time. Is there anywhere you would direct people to if they want to look into your work more?
Probably just the website, of the Insight Meditation Society, which is where I'm located. And the website is simply dharma.org, DHARMA, dharma.org. And so there's a lot of information on the website.
Great, nice and simple. All right, well, thank you again, Joseph.
Oh, you're very welcome. A pleasure talking with you.
Yeah, same.